Thanks for joining us this morning. We're going to end our 2021 seminar series today with what I think is going to be a really engaging session focused on water quality and agricultural practices, looking at the impact of agricultural practices on water quality and really what can be done to mitigate some of the negative impacts on water quality. It often seems that agricultural practices are, at odds with achieving water quality. And, with the expansion of tiling drainage systems, the reliance on nitrogen-based fertilizers, herbicides, it really only seems fair to ask, is it likely that we can achieve our water quality standards in areas of the state that are dominated by current agricultural practices? So I am really excited to hear from our four experts who join us today to lend their knowledge and to share their insight to these important issues. They bring extraordinary experience and vision to the subject with really unique and valuable perspectives. Trevor Russell is Water Program Director from Friends of the Mississippi with more than 20 years of experience in community organizing, environmental education, and environmental and public health advocacy. Leif Fixen joins us too. He is an agriculture strategy manager at the Nature Conservancy, where he leads the Conservancy's North America Farmer Advisor Strategy, working closely with the agriculture sector on issues related to water quality, soil health, and natural climate solutions. Dave Legvold, whose really remarkable career has ranged from that of an environmental studies teacher and school administrator to a software systems handler with John Deere. Dave currently farms 800 acres in Northfield, Minnesota, and Hannah Malecha, who actually cannot join us today because she is ill, was raised on the family farm that produced corn and soybean and now works in the family-owned Malecha tiling and trucking. And she was going to relate her knowledge regarding changes in precipitation induced by climate change, but perhaps Dave will tackle that in her stead. Our consortium is structured to give each of our panelists about 15 minutes on some aspect of their choosing on agriculture and water quality, followed by about 40 minutes of discussion and Q&A from you. Please feel free to type questions in the chat feature of WebEx at any time, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So let me introduce formally our first speaker, Trevor Russell. He has served as Friend of Mississippi River's Water Program Director since 2006. Trevor's work includes federal and state water quality advocacy, education, communications, and coalition development. He coordinates the Minnesota Environmental Partnership Water Cluster, advancing legislative and administrative policies that protect and restore water quality and river health in Minnesota. Trevor represents Friends of the Mississippi River on both the Mississippi River Network and the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative steering committees working to advance river-related policy and funding opportunities at the federal level. He has a degree in economics from Colorado College. Trevor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mark, for having me. Can everyone, Mark, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. And I'm going to try to scroll back to the beginning of this presentation proper. Can everyone see that okay? Let me try
Yes.
This view might be. Okay. That look better?
Yeah, that looks great.
Morning, folks. I'm Trevor with Friends of the Mississippi River. I won't dwell too much on who we are and what we're about, but did want to note that FMR is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We work in four main areas of work: land conservation, river corridor management, water quality, and stewardship and education. I coordinate the water program, and so I just wanted to share a little bit about our vision for the Mississippi River and water quality, and that is that the Metro Mississippi River and its watershed would meet all water quality standards and fully support aquatic life in Minnesota. I'm not going to dive into a whole lot of water quality information. We could write a whole report on the status and trends of water quality in the Metro Mississippi River, and we did. It's called the State of the River Report. You can read it anytime at stateoftheriver.com, but I did want to just dive into sort of three of the top ag-related water quality issues that we encounter most frequently that set the stage for some of this conversation. So the first relates to, sorry, let me go back one, phosphorus. I'm sure you're all familiar with the problems that phosphorus can cause in our surface water systems because, frankly, we've made such remarkable improvements in wastewater treatment plant phosphorus removal. The present state is that cropland runoff and related stream bank erosion from changes in upland hydrology are the largest source of phosphorus to the Mississippi River and many of our state's waters. Similarly, with regard to sediment, about 3/4 or so of the sediment entering the Metro Mississippi River is from the heavily agricultural Minnesota River Basin. And then with regard to nitrate, the lion's share, about 72% of nitrate to Minnesota surface water statewide is from our croplands. There is no more telling visual of this challenge than here. This is where the sort of brown and muddy Minnesota River meets the relatively clean and healthy Mississippi River at the Sacred Bdote, or confluence of Fort Snelling State Park in St. Paul. But I do want to note that this isn't just sort of a Metro Mississippi River problem. This is a statewide problem. This is older data. About 40% of our waters are impaired. It's closer to 50% now. Statewide, about 10% of private wells that are tested exceed the health risk limit of 10 parts per million and are not safe to drink. And we have many communities throughout the state with elevated levels of nitrate in their community drinking water sources. So this isn't just a Metro River problem. This is a statewide problem. And one portion of this problem is we've got a lot of high intensity row crops like corn and soybeans that dominate our agricultural landscape statewide. And these kinds of crops really sort of cause two families of problems, one when they're there and one when they're not. When they're there, annual row crops planted in the spring or harvested in the fall, they require intensive fertilization, artificial drainage, sometimes tillage, and pesticide treatments. And these pollutants are prone to leaching off of the landscape and either into our groundwater and our surface water. And I just have to say, this is not farmers' fault. This is the attributes of annual row crop systems, that they don't do a great job of holding their water or nutrients in the soil. So don't blame farmers here. It's the nature of the crops themselves. The second issue is when those crops are not there. And sorry, this is a little blurry, but this is a satellite image of the upper Midwest Corn Belt in late fall. And after the fall harvest, our soils are often left barren and unprotected from wind and rain for months. In fact, vegetation doesn't really begin growing on these soils until sometimes late May, early June the following year, when the next round of crops are planted. And this is what we call the big brown spot. This is the single largest reason we've got these sediment and nitrate and phosphorus related problems in our state. This is why our waters are polluted. It's also a major cause of our climate and our habitat and our soil health and our pollinator declines. And so why aren't we doing a better job of addressing this? And our answer is, while there are a lot of people that work really hard on these issues, and you'll hear some of them later in this forum, we're not using the full set of tools to solve the problem. For generations, we've really stuck to three primary tools to address our water quality issues. And the first is voluntary cost share, where the government pays farmers to implement conservation practices like, say, a traditional rye cover crop. And those can be very effective at a parcel scale, but they're often ephemeral, i.e. they cease once those payments stop, and they're expensive to scale up over millions of acres. We also use land retirement tools, which are very effective from an environmental perspective, but they're expensive and they take a lot of land out of production. So if you're going to concentrate enough land retirement in any given area to achieve your water quality goals, you would really be undermining the economic productivity of that local region. And then the last is regulatory. And these can be effective, but are often really controversial. Many of you will remember the fight over the buffer rule a few years back in Minnesota. And once political winds change or pendulums swing, often those regulatory tools can go away. And so while any of those three tools, I want to be really clear, can be super effective at a local or parcel scale, we don't feel that we're trying to solve a parcel scale problem. We're trying to solve a landscape scale problem. And how do we know that? There's a lot of information on this slide. But it is also the most important slide you're going to see from me today. So if you don't remember anything else from anything I say, remember this slide. This is data from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's 2013 Nitrogen to Minnesota Surface Water Study, and it combines a list of sort of all of the best management practices and implementation rates that we would need to have in place to achieve our nutrient reduction strategy goals in Minnesota. And there's a lot of background. We could spend a day on this thing, but what I want you to know is there's a lot of 100% here. And we could do virtually everything 100% perfectly and still barely get to our clean water goals. But doing many of these 100% is totally impractical. So I'm just going to give you 3 examples from here. The second one, fertilizing 100% of our annual row crop fields at 80% maximum return to nitrogen. Dave Legvold can tell you that would probably bankrupt a significant number of farmers in Minnesota. The second would be 100% cover crop adoption on all annual row crop acres in Minnesota. At the current rate of about $50 an acre for row crops, times 15 million acres of just corn and soy, you're talking $750 to $800 million a year, every year, forever, just to get that one bullet point item. We're not going to have the resources to do that. And then the last one, 100-foot buffer on all waters in the state. The fight we got to just get 50-foot buffers on some of our public waters was significant. We're not going to get 100-foot buffers on all of our public waters. So what this chart should tell you, or this chart, which is the same information simply deployed in sort of a graphical context, is that we need millions of acres of vegetative cover on our landscape. And we're not going to get there with regulation, land retirement, or cost share programs because they're too expensive. The goals are too big. And we need some different tools. So that's not to say that nutrient and fertilizer efficiency and tile water treatment and pea fertilizer and manure efficiency aren't useful tools because they are essential components of the solution. But it is simply to say that they cannot get us more than a small share of the way towards our total nutrient reduction strategy goals. Or to put it another way, we cannot BMP our way to clean water. It's not mathematically possible. What could we do? I want to introduce us to a topic or a phrase called continuous living cover, or CLC crops. These are crops that make use of sort of shoulder season sunlight and precipitation. That is, they grow during the spring and fall months, as well as sometimes the summer months, to reduce that big brown spot to effectively 0. And they have a host of environmental benefits associated with them that are really powerful. The theory of change I want to introduce here is that the only way we're going to get to our clean water goals is by filling the big brown spot with continuous living cover cropping systems at a landscape scale. CLCs are different. These are crops that have the environmental attributes of conservation practices, but they can also be harvested and sold for a profit by producers. That means that they can scale up on the land without having to A, compromise the prosperity of farms, or B, rely on taxpayer-funded cost share programs. There's lots of examples here that I could get into. I won't get into all of these, but I'll just call out a couple. So one example would be Kernza, the first one here. This is the sort of the science baby of switchgrass and wheat. So it, from a root system below the ground, behaves as if it's a perennial prairie plant with roots that can sometimes get 16 feet deep in the ground. But above ground, it's a wheat plant that is producing an edible, delicious wheat that you can make breads and beers and cookies with. A second example would be camelina. So this is a cover crop that can be interplanted into corn in the fall. It will begin to grow. You harvest the corn over the top of it. It will overwinter, come back up in the spring, and set oil seeds that can be harvested before a soybean goes in. So that is now 3 harvests instead of 2 for the producer who's growing that crop. Diversifies your income streams, diversifies your cropping systems, but it keeps continuous living cover on the ground year round. It fills the big brown spot. And because in either of those cases, you can sell the crop that you're growing, those producers are not relying on taxpayer subsidy, i.e. we can scale these things over a much larger acreage. Lots of examples. For the purposes of time, I won't dwell on this further, but we're doing 3 main veins of work to help accelerate CLC adoption in Minnesota, and I just wanted to avail this group of some of these efforts. The first, we are blessed to be home to the world's leading institution on advanced continuous living cover cropping systems. That's the University of Minnesota's Forever Green Initiative. They're developing a series of perennial food and biomass crops, as well as winter oilseeds, forage cover, and more that can help accelerate the adoption of market-based profitable CLCs in our landscape that meet our environmental goals as well. A second essential tool here is providing leadership. Last year, we helped create the Forever Green Partnership Steering Council, which includes organizations like, Minnesota Department of Agriculture, commercial supply chain companies, community development groups, Minnesota Farmers Union, Minnesota Corn Growers Association, staff with experience from Nori and General Mills and PepsiCo, as well as farmers of color and indigenous agricultural interests, all working collaboratively to provide leadership and strategic guidance on how to roll these crops out in the landscape. And then last, we know that we need a more supportive funding and policy environment. And I won't go into all of this in any detail, but just to say that there are policy and funding opportunities to provide more funding for genetics and scaling work, to help invest in value chain and enterprise development, some risk management tools, because right now farmers aren't playing on a level playing field when it comes to things like crop insurance for CLC cropping systems. There are some federal program barriers with regard to sort of existing federal cost share, risk management, finance, RMA, FSA related programs. And then we don't always have the technical assistance and farmer to farmer outreach with folks that have familiarity and facility with these crops that we'd like. So these things all need to improve over time, and they can and will. But I think the conclusion, what I hope you can take away from my talk, is that while nutrient management and tillage management and cover crops and cost share adoption are all essential tools to getting to clean water, they are necessary but not sufficient. We can't get to clean water with 16 million acres of annual row crops and a big brown spot every winter. And so our goal is to help find a way to accelerate the adoption of market-based continuous living cover cropping systems that can fill that big brown spot and achieve our environmental goals, while at the same time enhancing prosperity and profitability for the producers that are growing them. And that was only 13 minutes, Dave. So I think Mark, so I think I'm 2 minutes under, and I'll pass it back to you.
Oh, hey, that was great presentation, Trevor. Thanks for the work you put in. Really enlightening. So let me introduce our second speaker. Leif Fixen is an ag strategy manager for the Nature Conservancy. He leads the Conservancy's North America Farmer Advisor Strategy and agricultural initiatives in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, working closely with the agricultural sector on water quality, soil health, and natural climate solutions. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, Leif was the Pacific Northwest Conservation Program Manager for American Farmland Trust, working on strategies and programs for increasing the voluntary adoption of conservation practices by farmers and ranchers. He was a farm planner with the Snohomish Conservation District in Washington State, and before that, the City of Boston's urban forester. Leif is an alumni of the Washington Ag Forestry Leadership Program, recipient of the American Society of Agronomy Excellence and Advocacy Award, and sits on numerous local and national ag and conservation advisory boards and committees. Leif grew up on a small farm near Brookings, South Dakota, and holds a BS in agronomy and forestry from South Dakota State University. Leif, take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, back when I was a dairy planner for a conservation district, I used to joke that I'm probably the first and last farm planner urban forester that you'll ever meet. So anyway, kind of a random background, but excited to be here talking to you guys. Let's see. Presentation. You guys see in presentation mode? Assuming yes. Real quick. So
yeah, looks real good, Leif. Looks great.
Awesome. So Leif Fixen. I have some responsibilities for the Nature Conservancy, both with our North America program as well as locally here on our chapter ag team. So our chapter here is Minnesota, South Dakota, and North Dakota. And I work with a couple other folks that you guys have probably run across, Rich Biskey and Peter Mead, kind of on the local ag team. So through this presentation, I'm going to kind of float back and forth between some of our North America projects and then some of our local projects. So for those of you new to the Nature Conservancy, TNC, we're a global nonprofit. We function in 72 different countries, roughly 4,000 employees, a quarter of which are scientists. So we're a science-based organization. Got our start really focusing on land conservation, so preserving, unique and natural, acres and places. And about 15 years ago, we really started to get into the ag space as we started to, I guess, realize that even if we protect the acre, if we don't protect what's happening to both the water and our climate, we're going to lose these cool natural spaces. And so we've got kind of three primary priority areas. So tackling climate change, protecting land and water, and then where I spend a lot of my time is the provide food and water sustainably. And kind of what you heard from Trevor, if we're doing that right, we're gonna be hitting the other two priority areas. So real quick, I won't spend a lot of time on this other than to just communicate, that the theme of this talk is going to be how do we accelerate change, right? And so real quick, what is the change we're looking for? Well, we're looking to get enough practices on the landscape to achieve our water quality goals. And so for the most part, our goals line up with the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force goals, and that we're focusing on nitrogen and phosphorus loading in the Mississippi River, as well as we've got some climate goals related to carbon. And we're looking at getting that kind of through three different landscapes. And the first I'll talk about is infield practices. So Trevor was 100% right. We're not going to get our water quality or our climate goals or our biodiversity goals by focusing on infield practices alone. But infield practices are an important part of this, right? And the main goal here is, everything that falls on an acre or is applied to an acre, we want to try and keep on that acre, right? And so we think of that in four different primary practice change areas. So how do we get more cover crops on the ground? How do we diversify crop rotations? This picture here in the middle, that's actually a field of Kernza up near St. Cloud, and that's a bale of Kernza straw. So how do we get more perennials into our crop rotations, stuff like that? And then how do we reduce tillage? So strip till, no till, stuff like that. And then all of that has to be underpinned by precision nutrient management. So making sure that we're feeding all plants that grow on these agricultural lands as precisely and accurately as we possibly can. So the other two landscape areas that we're focused on is what we kind of lump all of this under our edge of field strategy, but it gets more or less lumped into two different categories. One is true edge of field. So practices that go right along the side of the field. So grass waterways, buffers, kind of working wetlands. And then the other category in here is what we call our downstream practices. So think large floodplain reconnection stuff down in the southern reaches of the Mississippi River, bigger projects that traditionally TNC has and so it's the combination of those kind of three categories of practice change that is going to get us to the environmental goals that we have. So how do we change practice on the landscape? This is at TNC, we're all about theories of change, developing them and then testing them out. This is our current ag strategy theory of change, and really what I want to hit on real briefly, and then I'm going to take a deep dive into this farmer advisor strategy, but is is it's not going to be one strategy that works. It's going to be a mixture, and it's going to be several different approaches. So the 5 primary ones that we're focused on at TNC are farmer advisors. So how do we get all those other voices that a farmer's talking to kind of to work together? The next one, and I'm going to go into deeper depths on this one in this talk. The next one is supply chain. So that's both corporate social sustainability as well as developing supply and demand signals from consumers. Rented farmland, 50% of row crop acres now, or actually over that, is rented. This is going to pose all kinds of challenges as it relates to perennial cropping systems, environmental markets, building soil health that may take decades, stuff like that. So how do we evolve those acres that may be in short-term leases? Public policy is a huge one, and then demo to scale. So that's like showing that these practices work, building the body of evidence behind whether it's the economics or the agronomics, and building confidence that these systems are going to work. So, but today I'm going to talk about the role that the farmer advisor has in getting more conservation practices on the landscape. Whether it's we're in this area right now, we end up being focused on kind of infield practices, because that's, I think, going to be most comfortable for a lot of the groups to agronomists to talk with their farmers about. But the long-term goal here is to hopefully use these as a vector for getting edge of field practices as well. And to do this, we really wanted to kind of prove out and build some evidence behind like this theory of change, right? And so, we've done some survey work, and we've done some research into basically saying, yeah, we're on the right track. And so we've partnered with Purdue on a lot of this work that you're going to hear about today. They did a large commercial producer survey. So really, that's any farm that grosses $500,000 in revenue a year. So, and we asked them, where are you getting their information? As you can see, university publications is number 1, but right underneath that is industry. So if right now the majority of acres across the Midwest, row crop acres, are getting their information from a combination of university and industry. But as we transition to ask, okay, well, of those acres that are getting cover crops, where are they getting their information? It's not from industry. And what I'll highlight here that isn't written on this slide, I should maybe add it. Right now, nationally, we're averaging about 4% of acres getting cover crops, right? And so our theory of change is that if we're going to quickly get to more acres using cover crops, we ultimately need to move this group right here, the industry or retailer and the certified crop advisors, up on this chart. And so how are we going to do that? Well, one of the longest partnerships we have in our with TNC is with the Certified Crop Advisors Program and the American Society of Agronomy. And overall, TNC runs what we call an influence strategy. And it really embraces the data that's on this chart. And this chart is from a survey that we've been funding through the Certified Crop Advisors Program, and that twice now. So every 5 years, we send out a survey that goes to all CCAs across North America, and they fill it out. And I forget what percentage, but it's we get almost a 30% response rate, which is really great. Anyway, this is why we're focused on farmers advisors right here, is that if we get one agronomist to change kind of their thinking as it relates to cover crops, soil health, perennial cropping systems, we can get 70 clients and 40,000 acres, right? That's for one person, one mind changing. So that's really at the core value of why we're focusing on farmer advisors. So how are we doing that? Well, we're mainly doing it through the certification program itself by developing endorsements and stuff like that, as well as helping organize and fund training programs. The number 1 requested training topic right now is cover crops. And and so then the second part of this is, okay, well, how do they want to learn, right? So they want localized information, and they want in-person field day type trainings. So, and anyway, so there's a whole, there's a website right there at the bottom, and I'll share my slides. There's 50 different slides on cool little insights from that survey. And anyway, so a good example of one of the programs that we did with them is we called it the working title was the Cover Box program. The idea was, like, how can we just send out like a kit, a cover crop kit that one of these agronomists can start to experience, play with, test it out. And so part of it was a 4-part webinar series that we did. And then the second part is doing in-field trainings. So like it's training the CCA so that they feel comfortable going and doing essentially demonstration plots on their clients' farms. And so in order to do a demonstration plot, you need to be able to communicate the benefit. We put together soil health toolkits to help do that. By the way, we were hoping to get like 50 to 100 people interested in this program. We got 936 people tuning into the webinar series, and we got just under 40 people enrolling in the actual field part of this. So we're pretty excited about that. The next category of work that we're doing in this space is we call it recognition, but ultimately it's how do we lift up and help farmers find retailers that are doing a good job, that are being responsible with the nutrients and their recommendations, as well as kind of help them tell that story of the industry is changing. And the 4 nutrient stewardship certification program is an example of that. This was launched in partnership with what was the International Plant Nutrition Institute and the Fertilizer Institute. This August, we got our first certified retailer pictured here in Minnesota. This is the Big Lake Nutrient Dealership, and we're in the process of bringing on a bunch more retail locations through this. The certification has a location is reviewed on 32 different standards, and it's a third-party auditor. There's the Minnesota Nutrient Stewardship Council that basically governs those standards and approves each individual certification. So there's more to come on that, but there's a couple more things I want to hit on here. So the next category of work we're doing in this space is ultimately focused on making the business case to ag retailers and why they need to shift from a business model that's focused on margins to a business model that's focused on services. And to do this, again, we realized that we needed to build a body of evidence to communicate so that when we walked into that ag retailer and said, hey, you need to rethink your business, it wasn't just TNC saying that, it was a whole bunch of data saying that. And so to do that, we partnered again with Purdue. The large commercial producer survey was part of this conversation, right? So we wanted to be able to say, this is what your customers are thinking right now, right? And then we took that and we did a series of focus groups. And what we did is we identified 5 different ag retailers. We did focus groups with each one of those retailers. And then we had them say, give us a cross section of your clients. And then we did focus groups with each of those clients. And we asked them mirrored questions to basically build trust and faith that if they start heading in this services direction, their customers will get there. And we also want to identify some barriers and on both ends to this change, right? And stuff like that. So it was really fascinating. Whole nother presentation based on this body of research. The moral of the story was basically right now, an ag retailer will help if they ask. I'm really nervous about this black bar right here. Does not help. That's one of our goals, is we need to change that. And I want to make this bottom box over here on the left bigger, actively brings and promotes conservation practices. The important bar over here on the right is this brown one. Adopts ag retailer suggested conservation practices. 40%. That's a great number, right? Like, so how do we how do we get ag retail, the trusted advisor, to bring more conservation practices to these farmers? Because they listen. The farmer listens to these people, and that's what this research just proved. Great takeaways. Adoption varies significantly. Interestingly enough, everybody recognized that the future is in these conservation practices, and it's coming. You know, this bullet right here, farmers need proof of conservation practice ROI before embracing them, is tied directly to this next one, agricultural retailers' role, like challengers or followers. You know, so there's this risk, and do we move too early into this space, or like, are the farmers actually going to come with us? You know, the other kind of key thing here for this group is regulation and public incentives are going to play a role in practice adoption in the future. Yeah, so this was another one. Conservation practices, a topic for conservation or conversation, but not necessarily a gateway to immediate profitability. Data stewardship is going to be so important, and I think a lot of the folks that are paying attention are seeing that as a huge opportunity. And everybody just kind of overall said that the future is going to be different, and it's changing very, very quickly. The last category, and I know I'm over time, I'll hit on this real quick, is, okay, how do we incentivize more change? We're thinking of this in two different categories. So the idea of these conservation agronomists. So NRCS has embraced this, MDA's embraced this. It's showing up in different states all over the place. And what these are is, you know, it's half public dollars funding some, you know, like one of these agronomists' salary, and half retailer, you know, retailer covered. Another thing, and Troy Daniels, our NRCS state con, you know, he's funding Central to do trainings for both his staff as well as other groups that ask for it. So, you know, helping cover some time of these trusted advisors that have been playing in this space. The Minnesota Soil Health Coalition kind of is part of that program as well. And then another program that we launched here in Minnesota through some private dollars, as well as some funding from Cargill, is equipment cost share for ag retail. So we've got, you know, in this last year, we bought 7 different pieces of equipment, or I'll rephrase that. We covered 35% of the cost of 7 different pieces of equipment, kind of throughout the state. And the whole goal here is to kind of create some entrepreneurship around this, you know, help de-risk that transition to a services-based business model. So apologize for going over time, and I'll leave it there.
What an interesting presentation, Leif. That was, you know, one of the reasons I love doing this water issue seminar is I just learn a ton every 2 weeks about something I realize I know very little about. That was just really interesting. One of the slides that you had said, you know, that one of the things we have to do is understand the perspective from the farmer level. And on another slide, you said, the future is going to look different. And on that note, it is a pleasure to introduce our final speaker today, Dave Legvold. Dave is a retired environmental studies teacher and school administrator who worked in public education for 35 years. After working for John Deere as a controller, trainer, and software systems handler, he became education director for Eagle Bluff Environmental Learning Center in Lanesboro and signed on as executive director of the Cannon River Watershed Partnership and coordinator of the Southeast Minnesota Wastewater Initiative. He frequently speaks to civic, environmental, and agricultural groups about the need for conservation of our soil and water. He does presentations each year at the Eco Experience, Minnesota State Fair. Dave operates an 800-acre corn and soybean farm in Northfield that serves as a living laboratory for nearby Carleton College, St. Olaf College, as well as for the University of Minnesota students and faculty. His farm is a Minnesota Agricultural Water Quality Certified operation. Dave was going to be joined today by Hannah Malecha, who was raised on a southern Minnesota farm that produced corn and soybeans, and is presently helping to run the family business, Malecha Tiling and Trucking. She can't be with us today, but I was told that she is equally at home in a backhoe, operating a D6 dozer, or driving numerous tractors. Really going to miss her presence today, but perhaps Dave can step in and take over what she was going to tell us about her experience in agriculture. Dave, you have the floor, and looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's exciting to be with a group of folks who I categorize as those who get it. So thanks for all the work that you folks do. And we'll try to bring up this presentation, and hopefully it will work out. All right. Is that present?
Looks good, Dave.
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Yeah, this is kind of the introductory slide showing Malecha in her finery, because she was chosen as an ambassador for the defeat of Jesse James days in Northfield. So she is traveling throughout the state as an advocate for our community. And she also is an advocate for young people entering agriculture. Let's see now, how do I advance this?
You can probably just advance it by going to your down arrow on your presentation mode.
Okay, that doesn't seem to be
Hmm.
firing up.
Otherwise, Dave, on the left side of your screen, there'll be kind of a long little tool options. There'll be like a zoom in, a zoom out, and there'll be an up and a down arrow. That I don't see that because you're the presenter.
No,
It's
that's
pretty small.
It's not present on my screen. It's not present on my screen now, so I'm gonna try to escape out of this and see. No, it just seems to be locked up.
Yeah, it might be frozen here.
I wonder if you try to just restart your presentation again, Dave, and maybe it'll come up live.
Yeah.
And
Okay, I'm trying to escape out of it, but that doesn't seem to work. Well, shucks. Okay, there we go.
Oh, sorry, I just kicked you out.
No, this is.
I just shared my screen to kick you out and see if that would help. So if you want to go back, I'll stop sharing. If you want to open up your presentation, we'll try it again.
All right, I'll go back to share. All right.
you're back up again.
Yeah, it still won't advance. Huh?
I wonder if you get out of the presentation mode and just go to.
Right.
Oh, there we
go.
Advance.
Now that's what Hannah looks like in her work clothes out on the job site where her family company does tiling. So what's precipitating the necessity to change? Science and climate change. And this is a wonderful photo from probably back in the 60s when we plowed everything and planted crops in the traditional way. This is the moldboard plow, which was the instrument of choice in breaking open our prairies and our rich corn belt soils. And as we look at it, it's always the way it's been done. However, disaggregated soil will blow, it washes, and the more significant thing is that it degrades organic matter. So even today, we have these massive moldboard plows that invert the soil profile, bury the residue, incorporate massive amounts of oxygen which just fires up the soily bugs, and they have a generous dose of carbon to feed on. And so they're busy metabolizing the carbon and burping it off as CO2. In this bit of work done by Iowa State and USDA in Fayette County, Iowa, we can see what happens with various tillage operations. So if you look on the left side, the moldboard plow, the lighter blue bar shows the amount of CO2 that is emitted in the first 5 minutes, 569 pounds. And in 24 hours, 1 acre of soil emitted 2,290 pounds. That's a metric ton. Carbon dioxide is difficult to see. You can't smell it, but with the proper equipment, we can sense it and measure soil respiration. If we continue to the right, you can see that as we get less invasive with the soil, carbon emissions decrease. What about carbon emissions? What does that harm? Well, it is the soil microbial community chewing up our organic matter and burping it off into the atmosphere. And so with heavy tillage, we are degrading the very engine, the heart of the soil, which is organic matter. And people comment about how farmers are burning all that fuel. Well, a gallon of diesel emits 22 pounds. And so that virtually pales compared to the amount emitted in 24 hours, because it takes about 9 gallons to plow an acre of soil. So I've departed from that kind of work and have adopted a strip till machine that was developed and built in Faribault, Minnesota. And it is a machine that carries a fertilizer tank, and it contains tillage equipment that does strip till, which tills a very narrow path in the soil. And as you can see, it will tolerate and endorse running through copious amounts of residue, which is a vital part of protecting our soil. So I don't know if this is going to run or not. It's an animation. There we go. This is a significant departure from regular tillage that you see. This is a strip that has been tilled. It's about 9 inches deep. It's about 6 inches wide. The soil is nicely prepared. It's not pulverized, but it is just left in kind of a lumpy condition. And the little white dots that you see in the soil are fertilizer. So fertilizer is applied exactly where we need it to be. The best thing of all about this photo is the amount of residue you can see on either side of the strip. And this is what I do on my farm. And when I complete the strip till, I've put about 40 pounds of nitrogen, 60 pounds of phosphorus, 75 pounds of potash, a little bit of sulfur, and some zinc. And that's it, but not too heavy on the nitrogen. And the fuel cost is 0.6 of a gallon per acre. So it's very fuel efficient, as well as enhancing fertilizer efficiency. When we plant soybeans, this shows a soybean field where the beans are growing, and the kind of residue that we planted into. I do practically nothing to the corn stalks. So all I do is just plant right into them, and the soybeans are robust. It's narrow row planting. So there is excellent shade to suppress weeds, and it is an easy way to plant beans. Late in the season, this is what stuff looks like. Critters have pretty well chewed the residue up and have begun to drag it down into their burrows, which means organic matter is being sequestered in the soil. So who's using no-till and strip till? These are the states around us, and this is USDA data. So I'm wondering if somebody out there in the audience would care to make a guess where Minnesota comes in. Anybody?
Pretty low, I'm guessing.
Pretty low, I'm guessing. Give me a number.
15%.
I have 15%. Well, there it is. Minnesota is at 5%. And that's no wonder we see the big brown spot when we look at Minnesota from high up in space. We also use cover crops, and these are cover crops growing in amongst our corn kind of mid-season. This is a video of my son who has a really interesting, yep. Well,
So Dave, usually for sharing videos, you have to share that as in your web browser. Oh, there we go.
I saw the broadcast spreader that our co-op was having us pay to do the interseeding and thought, I think there's a better way than that. This idea from some research that St. Olaf College did on some of our lands where they interseeded on a separate process when the corn was about foot and a half tall. I just decided to save a step and do it all at once. I am a lazy farmer. I like to do two things at once. Sometimes you can interseed with a second piece of equipment. I thought that it would be wise to do two things at once in the field, cut down on fuel consumption and add the cover crop seed at the same time. Our snowplow drivers spread salt on the roads in a similar way. It's just a broadcast spreader. So I came up with the idea to just mount two broadcast spreaders off the shelf salt spreaders, gauge them down, and add the cover crop seed to that. So really the whole process of adding these two salt spreaders was about $2,200 for the machinery or the equipment, a little bit of wiring, and some fun experimentation to make sure that we got the pounds per acre down based on the speed that we apply our nitrogen. The nitrogen applicator that we have was manufactured by a local equipment company that took an old planter apparatus, put hinges on it so we could get it down the road, and put the knives in so that we can knife our liquid nitrogen fertilizer into the soil. So really it's a homemade piece of equipment that we mounted our cover crop broadcasters to as well. I did do research on this, and it does show that there's no adverse effects to the growth and the production of the corn if you interseed when it gets to be about foot and a half tall.
So cover crops are great. You'll notice from that video that we apply nitrogen fertilizer in the greatest amount just when the corn is calling for nitrogen. We don't put on all the nitrogen in the fall and hope that some is left for spring, nor do we put it all on first thing in the spring. Our cover crops help to suck up any extra nitrate. We also believe that there are many benefits to cover crops, and one of them is soil temperature. Plants don't like to have their roots baking in bare soil. So this is on June 22nd. The soil temperature at high noon was 116 degrees. Where there's cover crops, it was 84. And so cover crops do produce a much more hospitable environment for plants to grow in. One of the other issues, and now I'm getting into Hannah's presentation, is climate change. What we used to see for nice fertile soils and flat fields was rains would come, rains would go. But we do have more serious storm events that tend to promote flooding. And so water management is becoming a much bigger issue. This is a trend chart showing one-day precipitation events. Pay attention to the red line. You'll notice that it is definitely uptrending, which means we get more extreme events. The precipitation map of Minnesota, I think if you look at the upper left map and the upper left corner of Minnesota, you can see there's an area that got less than 20 inches. As we move along through the decades, that area persisted. 1951 to 1980, it was still there. And 81 to 2010, it disappeared. But in the lower right map, if you look at the right side of the state, you'll notice that a large proportion of the state now gets more than 30 inches of rain per year. So we definitely are experiencing precipitation and climate change. Infiltration is the key to holding water. Sometimes I hear people say, jeepers, we got 2 inches of wonderful rain. And it wasn't how much rain did we get. The question is, how much rain did your soil capture? So heavily tilled soils lack porosity. If we have a good macroinvertebrate population, they provide channels. Poor infiltration causes the water to transport over the soil, carrying with it sediment and nutrient. But cover crops really do enhance infiltration. This is a fancy infiltrometer, basically a coffee can, that we snuggled into some heavily tilled soil and poured in 300 milliliters of water. And these Carleton students timed it and found a little about 4.5 minutes to infiltrate 300 milliliters. By contrast, just over the fence line in my field, which is a trashy no-till field, there you can see it took 48 seconds to infiltrate the same amount of water. So we have to develop a soil environment that will infiltrate water well. Many people think that if you farm flat land, that doesn't erode. However, this is an area just outside Northfield. It is flat as a tabletop, but during heavy precipitation events, it definitely does erode. So what about drainage tile, a way to manage water? We find that drainage tile has its downsides, and that is the transport of nutrient. Nitrogen in our surface waters does not come from natural sources to any great degree. It comes from agriculture. So this is a problem that we need to own. When you install drain tile, this was Hannah's company. I don't know if this one will run either. We'll see. No. Anyway, with drainage water management, when you put tile in the ground, that's where the water table is. It would be really nice if we could do this. If we could raise the water table at certain times of the year and lower the water table when we need to do field operations. Well, the answer is we can with drainage water management. It's just a structure that intercepts the water in the field tile and holds it, keeping nutrient and water in the field for crop growth, or just to hold the water so it doesn't go downstream. And this is kind of the seasonal view. In winter, the water is held. In spring, it's released. Summer, we hold the water for the crop. And in the fall, when we need to do field operations, then we can release the water. This is actually what one of those structures looks like as it's being installed. I do have 5 of these on my farms, and they're very inexpensive, about $1,200, and they do really good work, and they don't take up much room. I also have something called a saturated buffer, and this is a schematic of how it works. If you look at the right side of the picture, you can see water coming in to the control structure, and then there are laterals that go out into the buffer that are just nothing more than field tile, but it's operating in reverse because we're forcing water out into the buffer. So we treat the water by utilizing the hydraulic gradient. It becomes groundwater, or it seeps through the soil into the stream. And we also have significant amounts of evapotranspiration. All of this instead of dumping the water into the nearest tributary. This is what the structure looks like. It's simple. It's an exquisite functioning machine. that doesn't take much maintenance at all. And we can put data loggers in those white pipes that you see to measure the amount of water that's flowing through the structure. And through scientific analysis, we've found that we can treat about 45% of the tile water that comes off the field. This is my saturated buffer. Where you see the red flag, that is where the distribution line runs under the soil. Little white pipes are sampling tubes where we can pull groundwater. We have a set that's 10 feet away from the distribution line, and we wanted to see what happens. This is kind of the schematic of how it works. Water in from the field, water out to the distribution lines, and then there are white circles, which are test pipes. And in some scientific work that St. Olaf did, we found that the tile water from the field was 8.65 parts per million, significantly below the drinking water standard. But after it had traveled 10 feet through the soil of the saturated buffer, we found that test pipes A, B, and C all showed significant reduction. Pipe E, I think maybe a toad or something crawled in that pipe and died, so it was pretty high in nitrate. But we're finding that this edge of field practice does reduce nitrogen significantly. So the edge of field practices, if the water reaches the buffer, it's lost. If the sediment reaches the buffer, the soil is lost. If the nutrient reaches the buffer, it is lost. So what do? I think transition out of tillage, build organic matter with no-till, strip-till, cover crops, livestock, grazing, manure, you name it. Build that organic matter. The 4 R's of nutrient management means the right product at the right rate, in the right place, at the right time. And that will move us along toward better water quality through better fertilizer management. And I encourage farmers to do their own on-farm research. Dig into the soil and find out what goes on. Seek technical assistance. You've got lots of folks out there who would love to have you come in and talk to them and pursue becoming an ag water quality farm. So we can grow robust crops if we preserve residue. And I think we can move along nicely toward better water quality if we do these things. So some folks who have spurred this along, and that's it for me. Thank you.
What a great presentation, Dave. Just fascinating to me what you've been able to achieve on your farms and how, how that might be employed in different areas. Can I ask you just straight up before we go to the questions, have other farmers that have they adopted your control box to keep water on the fields as you described? Has that caught on with others?
Very, very few. It's weird, and I think they're somewhat resistant to trying it. So I must say that I don't know of any people around me who have those control structures installed in their tile systems. But it's something that I bring out of education and allowing farmers to come and see how it works.
So Brooke, do you want to tackle some of the questions and such that we have entered into our chat?
Yeah, so let's we'll have to scroll back up here. I know we had some right away after Trevor's presentation. So it says here, how does federal agricultural policy help or hurt efforts toward more sustainable farming practices?
Sure, I could take the first crack at that, Brooke, and I did little bit lower in the chat, just give one example of how there's some barriers with just one set of NRCS equip practices. But in essence, no, we're not playing on a level policy playing field. And this could be a whole day long thing, but I think right now there's sort of a family of barriers. The first is that many of our sort of traditional BMP conservation practices aren't compatible with CLC crops, and I've put a few examples a little bit lower down in the chat. So I think we could explore opportunities to make EQIP, CSP, CRP practices more compatible. Consider allowing harvest of winter annual oilseed cover crops planted through cover crop incentive programs, at least initially, while those markets start to mature, or better fund the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative or the National Agroforestry Center for compatible CLC strategies. Similarly, with regard to farm finance, banks and FSA don't love giving loans to new crops or cropping systems that have some perceived higher risks. So we see an opportunity for the RMA to fast track development of crop insurance products for CLC cropping systems, and consider changes to the whole farm revenue program that could better accomplish that goal. And then with regard to some other federal opportunities, we do think there are opportunities within the Value Added Producer Grant Program, or the Ag Marketing Strategies Program, or LAMP, the Local Ag Marketing Program. We could also explore tax incentives or other financial investments. Fast track generally recognized as safe or GRAS certification for the food products that are coming through the CLC stream, and reanimate some strategies to allow basically federal grants and loans that allow producers to borrow against the value of any given CLC grain to help build on-farm infrastructure, which is a way we did a lot of grain storage related infrastructure back in the day. So there's a lot of opportunities at the federal level. And right now, I'd say most of our federal programs are geared, as you might think, towards maximizing sort of conservation, delivery, and productivity of our traditional cropland systems. And when we start talking about adding new crops into the mix, we're in this weird transition period where we don't quite have the tools that are optimized. And I think there's a lot of great folks that are doing a lot of work on this, not only the Forever Green Partnership here in Minnesota, but National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition that we're a part of, and others are starting to work on that. And boy, I hope the next Farm Bill starts to include some programs that are more capable of being compatible with CLCs.
So I think, we can kind of go about these questions as any one of you can take them, all of you can chime in. So as we're answering these questions, if either any of you have additions or additional comments you want to make, go ahead and feel free to do that. So I'll go ahead and tackle the next question here. Do we have enough organizations and people working on incorporating more continuous living crops into agricultural land? If not, how do we increase participation in this work? What does outreach and community engagement look like in agricultural communities?
I might answer the first part, and then, I know Leif and Dave do a lot more of the on-the-ground education and outreach in farmer communities. The first part of the answer is no. CLCs are a new enough concept that there are not enough folks really fully engaged in incorporating them onto the landscape. But I think Leif and Dave can speak better to what needs to happen to accelerate their adoption through the sort of farmer outreach and education vein.
Yeah, Leif, why don't you chime in on that a little bit? One of the things I was really interested in your presentation was, this mismatch in perception between the retailers in agriculture saying, well, if I make recommendations, it really doesn't get listened to, I think was the upshot of it. And then 40% of the farmers saying, well, we look to our ag advisors to give us recommendations. There seems to be a real mismatch in perception there.
So maybe I didn't do a good job. So you're thinking of the slide that showed like does not help, right?
Yeah, right.
So that was basically them saying that like when I'm thinking about conservation, like my ag retailer isn't going to help me, right? Like, so it's not that the ag retailer is bringing knowledge or ideas to the farm. It's straight up that like the farmers that want to do practices, when they ask their ag retailer, they just say that we don't do that. And so that for us, that's a problem, right? And that anyway, so that's what that's saying. So it's yeah.
I would
kind of back
comment
to that.
on
Okay.
that. I would comment that I had a very fortunate experience when I was nominated to be a 4R advocate. And I went to my agronomist and we talked about it, and he said, let's go full speed for it. And he was one of the greatest cheerleaders for conservation practices and better fertilizer management in our neighborhood. So I believe if somebody is resistant in your commodity organization, look for a different organization.
And that's exactly the message that we're trying to get out there. You know, so yeah, it's we want to shrink this box and we want to grow this box. And ultimately really I mean, we're okay with this, but we'd like to see this box shrink as well, right? So and that really ties into then the research we're doing into, you know, like it you know, how do we get ag retailers to see conservation as a business opportunity, right? Like, hey, I just bought a new cover crop interseeder. I need to get this across more acres. Let's, you know, all right, agronomy team, go out and sell cover crops, right? Like that's the kind of conversation that we're wanting to drive. So that this actively brings and promotes, you know, conservation grows.
Like many ag retailers are also seed providers. So it's in their best interest to promote cover crop use, because then they can sell cover crop seed.
And so kind of where so the phase 2 of that whole ag retail business model, or I guess the phase 3 now is, so we've worked with Purdue to develop this somewhat complicated business model, like planning device, you know, spreadsheet program. And what that does is it allows a farmer or a retail manager to kind of plug in what their business model is today, and then go in and say, all right, if I get this many acres or this percentage of my customers to switch to cover crops, it pulls in. It's like, here's what the potential is for cover crop seed sales. Here's what the potential is for, you know, herbicides for termination. Here's what the potential is for cover crop seeding and equipment and like custom services. So the idea is to give these retail managers a tool that they can do some business modeling based off of, like, okay, this is what my P&L statement looks like today. Margins are shrinking on sales. How do I make up for that? And so right now it's this somewhat complicated spreadsheet that you know, a couple of researchers at Purdue know how to use. The phase 3 of that we just got funding for is going to be basically turning that into like a website that will probably still require like some technical assistance to get that retailer comfortable with it. But like, is the idea there is it's, you know, we've got to shift the business model from rewarding just getting more product out of the door to really being either focused on profitability for the farmer or, you know, like this service model. And that kind of ties into, so why aren't they doing that today? Well, you know, one, change is hard. Two, there's risk in that, right? Like, and it is a bit of this chicken or egg, right? The retailers don't want to change until they get a demand signal from the farmers, and the farmers ultimately, I mean, this is part of our justification for the equipment cost share. Farmers don't want to go whole hog across the whole farm, because you're talking, you know, what, a soil warrior strip till toolbar is $250,000, right?
Right.
So they don't want to bite that bullet until they can play with it on 10 acres, 20 acres, 40 acres, right? And so how do we facilitate that trial, right? And then the second part of that is how do we make sure that that trial goes beyond just 1 or 2 years, but is like a 3 or 5 year trial, right? So anyway, like that all of this starts to get pulled into this kind of chicken or egg cycle of, okay, how do we break that cycle, and how do we de-risk both the farmer like making a business change as well as the ag retailer making a business change? There's a lot of programs through USDA and the state to help de-risk cover crops and strip till and all that other stuff. We really don't look at agribusiness too much right now, and that's kind of where we're wanting. I mean, we're wanting to test some things out. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I have had several farmers ask me if I would come and do 5 acres of strip till for them so that they could see what it looks like. And I usually say, it's going to look awful. It's going to look just terrible, and you're not going to like it. But if you have in mind what it is you're trying to accomplish with your soils, then let's talk. And if you're going to just do a 2 or 3 or 5 acre trial, it's not worth my time and it's not worth your time. But if you really are serious about it, then let's jump into this and really give it a try on a whole field basis.
We just did some filming to kind of document our cost share program for the equipment, and we sells cover crop seeds, and he bought a cover crop seeder, and it was a great anecdote that he just mentioned while we were like in between kind of filmings and other people were getting interviewed, and he said, boy, I was kind of sweating bullets this fall in that, like, I bought this equipment and I got like 2 farms signed up, and one of them was pretty big, and I was getting towards, like, we had 2 more days of seeding to do, and I was like, crap, I don't have anybody else lined up. And like later that day, the neighbor came, what are you doing over here? Well, we're doing XYZ. All right, well, why don't you try, I'll try that on this field, right? And he said he got 4 more farmers in that exact same, it was just this domino effect of like, yeah, I'll try that. Put it on this 20. Like it was anyway, so I was like, I told the folks that were doing that, I was like, make sure during his interview you get that story out of them. So because anyway. The follow-up to that, though, is how do we keep them doing it for at least 3 years, right? And so that's kind of our next, I guess, endeavor as it relates to cost share. Do we set up these new businesses with some funding so that neighbor that tried that out, like, hey, we'll give you a free cover crop seed for 3 years if you keep it going on this 40, so.
So as I'm scrolling through all of the comments here, it looks like there are some that you guys kind of jumped in a little bit on. And so with only having a few minutes left, I'm wondering if you guys want to like pick one of the comments. I think there was one, Leif, that you had suggested we could talk about in the break. Let me go back up to that. It was more on the kind of
Suzanne's
social
question,
science
right?
side.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Because clearly we can't get to all the great questions and comments that have been shared in the chat function. Yeah, if you guys could take a few and respond to them directly, that would be great.
So there was a comment from Susan here about wait, now I lost the original comment.
Yeah, so I've got it right here. Her question was, any ideas as to why agronomic advisors are not promoting cover crops to the same extent as other practices? I would say, a lot of these soil health practices are going to complicate the agronomics of these cropping systems, right? Whether and that extends to perennial crops as well, right? And in that comes risk, and in that comes risk of a business relationship, right? And it goes back to this thing that came out during the survey work and the focus groups are the agronomists or the ag retailers the pushers or the reactors, right? And so it to put it bluntly, like it can be a challenge in the first couple of years. That's a steep learning curve, right? And you need a farmer that really wants to make that change, that like you don't go in and say do cover crops and then you have a super dry spring like this and the cover crops consumed all the water and you're screwed for your cash crop, right? Like it's these little things and like just getting that message out there that this isn't a 1-year switch. This is a commitment for a longer term transition, right? And so I think ultimately there's fear of losing customers. There's fear of, it's not a simple, it's not simple,
Am I at least spot on there? I think there may be one other sort of missing element here, which is right now, especially if you're on ranted land, the idea of sort of making long-term investments in soil health are probably not the most practical choice for you because you don't know if you're going to reap the benefits 4 or 5 or 7 years from now. The other piece is that there's not a lot of direct economic pull in terms of immediate yield improvement or reduction in nutrient application, and there's some herbicide pressure reduction, but one of the things that I mentioned earlier is the idea of sort of cash cover crops. So the idea of being able to interseed, as Dave's son did. What if he's interseeding with camelina or pennycress? And those crops are just starting to come online now, and we're not ready to scale them at the 100,000 or million acres yet, but we probably will be within 5 or 6 years. What if he could interseed that corn stand with a camelina, harvest it in the spring, sell it before his soybean needs to go in? In that case, you've got a direct economic incentive or pull for the producers from the market to want to put these crops in, provided that the supply chains and markets are in place. So, if we were talking about, say, aviation biofuels, which is something we expect to stick around for quite a while, even as things like, electric fleet vehicles or fleet vehicles are transition to electric, there would be a direct economic incentive for that producer to want to plant that. And it would become incumbent upon a crop advisor or others to say, hey, I do need to play in this space, and I do need to prepare to help you acquire the seed and provide you the assistance that you need, because this is in your economic best interest. And if I don't do it, you'll go to somebody else.
It's very interesting. I worked with one of my landowners I rent from. We were both very interested in looking at relay cropping with camelina and soybeans. And so we began to look at the practicalities of this. It turns out that I would have to buy a new set of, I guess you could call them sieves or chaffers for my combine, several $1,000s. We also looked at where would we deliver our products to. And it turned out that I would have to truck this stuff way up north of the Twin Cities to a place that would take it. I've also run into the same thing with switching to growing wheat. Got a dandy wheat crop, and when I started to look around for places to take the wheat, their basic response was, "What do you want us to do with that stuff?" And it turned out that I needed to truck it about 40 miles. Otherwise, the penalty was $2 a bushel just to dump it in the nearest elevator. So there are practicalities that we have to wrestle with.
And Dave, that's a great point, and those are the challenges that we really do need to work through. I think from a positive side, we've worked through them before. We didn't used to grow soybean in Minnesota. We grew no soybean in 1950. Now we grow 8 million acres of it. So we have some history of bringing new crops into our rotations, dealing with the growing pains that come with markets and supply chains and infrastructure. But I'm hopeful that we can begin to leap some of those hurdles for CLC crops as we've done for our traditional crops.
Yes. I do think that we need to work on significant change in the commodity picture that we have now. And of course, what's near and dear to my heart is forsaking tillage, because by tilling our soils heavily, we destroy the ability to maintain water in the soil, nutrient in the soil, and of course, productivity.
Dave, I have a question for you, Mark, if I'm allowed to do that.
Oh, yeah, please do.
Just break the conversation here. One idea that surfaced from some of our national partners is the idea of creating a discount rate within the crop insurance system for folks that are using no-till, strip-till, or cover crops, i.e., the public share of your cost insurance could go from 60% to 70% if you're using those products, or the base is 50% instead of 60, but you can go up to 60 or 70 if you are, say, a no-till farmer. Do you think that would have a sufficient pull for producers, or is the cost of crop insurance pale in comparison to the cost of no-till equipment that it wouldn't move the needle? What would you recommend?
Crop insurance is a year-to-year thing, and purchasing equipment is a long investment. So I think crop insurance to me is transient. It flies away, and it changes every year. If you have the heart to change your entire production scheme with a tillage change or nutrient management change, that's how we really get stuff done. It's easy to discount crop insurance if you do no-till, but I've broached that to my crop insurance people, and it's just kind of like you're talking with two heads coming out of your collar.
Well, it's a little bit like the whole carbon craze right now, right? Like going from even 50 to 70% of a premium change, right? Like that 20 or 30% increase in coverage by the public, right? You're still only talking about $3 to $4, right, an acre. So I mean, for a lot of these farms, that's nothing, right? Like it's not worth doing the paperwork half the time. But where I'm going with that and tying it to the carbon is that, like, who knows what the price of carbon is going to be, at $15 a ton, same kind of numbers, right? Like the message needs to be that it's going to be a handful of dimes, not a dollar, that makes these soil health systems profitable, right? They're arguably, I mean, there's a lot of research out there that shows that they are, just from an agronomic standpoint. But like, how do we tip the scale just a little bit more to accelerate that adoption? That's where those crop insurance gets talked about, ecosystem service gets talked about, cost share, all that fun stuff.
So I was really interested, Dave, when you mentioned the trick question there that I'm glad I did not venture to answer, about how many Minnesota, what percentage of Minnesota farmers are employing, what was it, strip tillage, and it was 5%. I was going to guess quite a lot higher than that. Is it your sense, and anyone can chime in here, is it your sense that there's a lot of farmers out there who may be, holding back and looking at each other and wondering who's going to jump first on this, not wanting maybe to jump in first, and then it may change pretty quickly and drastically, or is it that there's something else at play that there's just not a lot of interest from other reasons? I'm just kind of wondering why the disparity in the percentage.
Yeah. In my work in public school teaching and administration, peer interactions are really effective and really powerful. So going back to when I was with Cannon River Watershed Partnership as ED, I was also involved in the Minnesota River TMDL. And we had meetings in southwest Minnesota. We had meetings at Lake Pepin, and discussing the whole idea that we need to do something to help clean up the Minnesota River. And the two organizations that were most resistant were Minnesota Corn and Minnesota Soybeans. And that was very disconcerting. I believe that if these organizations jump in and say, okay, folks, this is what we need to do for livelihood and for those who follow us, let's get on it. And I think that may have put together a cultural condition that's really difficult to resolve. In my particular area, right here around Minnesota, Northfield, we have kind of a hotbed of strip tillers, no tillers, cover crop users, and it's really nice to see this group of people. In fact, there's a group of farmers that we term the Magnificent Seven, who farm just west of Northfield, and they do a lot of stuff right, and it's a group thing with peer pressure and peer interactions playing a big part.
I actually cut this slide.
I like that cartoon.
I cut this slide from my presentation for time, but normally I anytime we're talking about how do we accelerate change, like this is part of my spiel. But this was a comic that was in Progressive Dairy, a few years back, and it's so relevant to what one of the barriers we're up against. So, and it's exactly what Dave was just talking about, right? So anyway.
That's a great cartoon.
So we are a few minutes past our time here. It's 10:36. So I do want to, maybe wrap things up here so that folks that have other meetings or things they need to get to here at 10:30, we can let them go. So I don't know if you guys wanted to stick around a little after we kind of close things off and continue talking, or if we just want to close it out. But I'll just thank all of you for joining us today, and thank Mark for pulling this together and finding these great speakers and having this very intriguing and much needed conversation. So thank you to everybody for joining us today and for all the work that you do as well on this important issue. So and thanks to everyone who joined us. It's always a pleasure having such a large audience out there, and you guys had some really great discussion today, lots of comments in the chat. So thank you for that. It always makes for a much more, better event when we have actual questions and comments and great discussion like this. So thanks for making this such a great event today.
Yeah, special thanks to our speakers today. They came together and agreed to do this on pretty short notice, really, to be fair. And I was really being sincere. I was truly excited to hear what each of our speakers had to say today, because they come from different perspectives. And it just seems to me, I don't think this is news to anybody, we really need to hear from these different perspectives. And I was sorry that Hannah couldn't join us today too, to talk about her perspective from the tiling perspective, and what she has learned from hard work, and ground truthing a lot of this stuff. It is really interesting and always very educating to hear what people have to say about this. And I just learned a ton today about this. Thanks to each of you for agreeing to be part of our consortium. And I thought it was really a great session. For everyone else out there who's still listening, our next, that ends up our 2021 seminar series. And we're going to charge into 2022 on the second week in January. What is that? The 15th, I think, or something like that. We're going to hear from Lee Engel, who is going to talk about the study on the Minnesota River, rather, talking about their study, taking advantage of the low flow caused by the drought, and looking at, I think it was phosphorus in the river and what they have learned about that. So that is going to be our first talk for the next year, and we're busy lining up new new seminars for the next year ahead. So looking forward to that. And thanks for tuning in today.